to a battle which was taken up today in the state's highest court, this too involving taxes and exemptions for religious institutions. Back in 2012, the city of Attleboro decided parts of La Salette Shrine should be taxed because the city argues they are not used for religious worship or education. But La Salette is appealing that decision, saying the entire property should be exempt from taxes under state law because it's all part of the religious mission. Joining me to fill in the blanks are Reverend Laura Everett. She's the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. Reverend, it's good to see you. Daniel Medway is Northeastern University Law Professor and WGBH News Legal Analyst. Dan, good to see you too. Let me start with you. You think Attleboro's right. Why should any part of the church's mission be taxed?
The argument is that tax exemptions are a privilege, not a right. The legislature's made a social policy determination that certain types of activities, whether it's a religious institution, an educational institution, or a hospital, get special tax treatment. If part of their property is used for a different purpose, then they should be taxed like others.
Anybody else in the country doing this?
Well, it's quite common, Jim, in other contexts. Not necessarily, I'm not aware of religious institutions.
I mean religious.
I'm not aware of it offhand.
I mean other contexts like universities or
Exactly.
something like that. If they're selling stereos at a store or something, that stuff. But, you know, most of us have the mistaken impression that this is constitutionally based.
Right.
Separation of church and state has nothing to do with the U.S. Constitution or state constitution. It's statutory.
Absolutely. The Massachusetts State Legislature, Chapter 59.
And virtually every state has recognized this
Absolutely.
thing. You're quoted in the Globe, Reverend, saying to try to divide religious space by an assessor, a local assessor, is both not right and not possible. Why isn't it right and why isn't it possible?
Well, certainly the Massachusetts Council of Churches and a really wide range of religious institutions are concerned that we've got local tax assessors making a distinction based on their own personal interpretation.
That's what they do about every assessment. When they assess my house, their interpretation is my house is worth X, and that's what I pay taxes on, or I challenge it.
So the tax assessors in Attleboro said 60% of the property is taxable and 40% is not. And so the sanctuary, the chapel, the monastery, they said that is not taxable, but
everybody agrees that shouldn't be taxable, right?
Yes.
That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
Go ahead.
But we understand that as a really narrow definition and in some ways arbitrary definition of what is a religious space.
Well, the disputes here, from what I understand, relate to a cafeteria and a gift shop. And what a cafeteria and a gift shop? What religious mission is carried on in a place where you're having a cup of coffee or buying a little trinket?
Again, this is about not making a distinction between worship and charity.
But why shouldn't we?
Well, because the self-definition of religious communities to make determinations about how they raise their funds. So we wouldn't want a local tax assessor saying, well, the way you pass the plate or the way that you have a bake sale is not a viable way of raising funds for a religious institution.
Okay, let me stay with you for one more minute. In a story I read, actually Jeff Jacoby wrote a piece, he's on your side, a columnist for the Boston Globe, says the ecumenical prayers are conducted in the cafeteria. Okay, so let's give you that just for a second. La Salette decides to buy a building with 12 condos in it. And it says this is part of the mission. They collect rent, they make a ton of dough. You'd make the same argument, right? They own condos. It's part of the mission for whatever reason. So I guess you would make the same argument, right? If they own it, it's part of the religious mission and thus tax exempt, right?
Again, we're making the case that religious institutions have the right to self-determine what is their charitable acts. In this case,
but my question is, if they determine that a condo, just as one example, should be tax exempt, that should be the final word, right?
In this case, in Attleboro, there was a building on the property that was used as an emergency shelter. Yeah. And so that was part of their charitable understandings, coming from scripture that says true religious worship is care of the widow and the orphan. Okay.
Let me get back to you and make Jeff Jacoby's argument in addition. The Eucharistic healing service and Mass is held in the Welcome Center, one of the places Attleboro wanted to tax. The ecumenical prayers are conducted in the cafeteria. The blessing of the animals is in the shrine's garden. Their point being, a variation on what the Reverend is saying, maybe it isn't a traditional setting, but we do religious things in these settings. That's our business, as the Reverend says. That's not yours. Why can't they make that determination? And why should the government decide that it's got to look and feel like a church for it to be religiously get a religious exemption?
Because the legislature has decided that they deserve special tax treatment. So if you're given this privilege, then with that privilege comes responsibility. And it makes sense, of course, that any organization, I don't view this as a case about religion, Jim. It's really a case about tax exemption and organizations that get the benefit of preferential tax treatment. So we want to make sure that assessors scrutinize their activities to make sure that they're not getting basically a subsidy.
You know, for people who are watching right now and say, who cares about what's going on in Attleboro? The implications of this for both are immense. If Attleboro wins this case, then cash-starved cities and towns, which is almost redundant, that's every city and town, could follow the same lead. Well, the Archdiocese in Boston, frankly, they don't use X for that, they use Y for this. This could mean billions of additional tax dollars for cities and towns, right?
There is that concern, and I completely understand Reverend Everett's concern about the slippery slope. If Attleboro wins here, where do we draw the line? At what point might towns become so aggressive that they really interfere with
So how do you allay her fears?
By looking at the fact-specific nature of this case, which is the only thing that's before the SJC. So you look at the cafeteria, Jim, as you pointed out, you look at the gift shop, you look at the maintenance shed, and you think there's a legitimate basis for arguing that these aren't for religious purposes.
And so in what I've read, at least on one occasion, maybe it's in an amicus or something, or maybe your organization has put it out, this could lead to the shutting down of certain smaller churches. If they lose an exemption, have to pay thousands, if not more, in taxes. But isn't the way that should be if ultimately the court determines that you're getting an exemption? By the way, when you get an exemption, that means my small business, my house, subsidizes you because the tax burden is transferred to them. If that's what the court determines and a church has to shut down, it's sad, but that's the way it goes, isn't it?
But it's also worth remembering that these religious institutions, and we're deeply concerned that there's been a very narrow understanding of what is a house of worship. Certainly this is a case about a Roman Catholic church, but we're setting precedent for local tax assessors for mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, Zen centers. What does a local tax assessor do with a Sikh gurdwara, where integral to religious worship is a meal? That's part of the founding principle. You can't just divide that up the same way that this cafeteria was parsed as not a religious activity.
Can we end on one agreement? Billions of dollars are at stake. Do we all agree on that?
Potentially, yes.
This is a very significant case for the well-being of religious institutions in Massachusetts.
Reverend, it's good to see you. Thanks
It's
so
really
much.
good to see you,
Dan,
Jim.
thanks so much
Jim.
for your time.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.